Hello guys, welcome to the 5 Minute Friday series. This week's episode is going to be a continuation episode from last week where we looked at the var keyword, but now we'll be looking at the other two keywords we can use to declare variables, and that is let and const. So to kick things off, we're just going to have a bit of a history lesson. So you've got here a timeline, or a JavaScript variables timeline. So we have 1997, which is the birth of JavaScript, all the way through to the modern day of 2021. So since 1997, the only way to declare a variable was through the var keyword, and this was the case up until 2015 when the keywords let and const came along. Now this wasn't something we could use straight away, it did take a bit of time, but in the present day, most major browsers now support let and const. So the obvious question to ask is, why are there three different ways to define variables, and what is the difference between the three? But before we can understand how var, let and const differ, we need to understand a computer sciencey concept called scope. Now the scope is important in JavaScript because it manages a variable's accessibility, so essentially means that these variables are available for use. And in the JavaScript language there are two different types of scopes. So you've got the global scope and the local scope, and the block and function are related to the local scope. So let's dive into VS Code now and talk about the global scope. Now the global scope is pretty simple to understand. When you start writing in JavaScript in a document, you're already in the global scope, and there's only one global scope throughout a JavaScript document. Now a variable is in the global scope if it's defined outside of a local scope, which we will speak about in a moment. Now all the variable keywords of var, let and const can live and be accessed inside the global scope. So let's just define a few variables now. So we've got var, and we'll just call this one a equals 10, close it off, and then I'm just going to log it in here. Just going to say a, and if we look in our browser we get the value of 10. Now we can do the exact same thing for let, and it will give us the same value, and then also for const. And because this variable is in the global scope, it can be accessed from anywhere, and that's because we haven't defined them in any other format or the opposite of a global scope, which is the local scope. Now as we saw in the slide, the opposite of a global scope is a local scope, and there are two different types. You've got function and block. So first let's take a look at the function scope. So I'm just going to write a few comments. Now a function in JavaScript defines a scope for variables declared using var, let and const. So what I'm going to do now is just paste a function I've pre-made. And as you can see in this function, I've named it holiday, and then I've got a comment of holiday function scope. So the scope now is inside the curly braces, and then I've created a variable of my holiday equals Spain. Now I'm just going to log this, and then if we look in the browser, you can see now it gives us a value of Spain. Now what do you think will happen if I console log my variable of my holiday outside this function? And if I do that, it gives us a reference error and saying my holiday is not defined. That's because once a variable is inside a function, it's inaccessible outside of that function, and the same rules will apply to let and const. So I'm just going to comment this out. What I'm going to do is just change the keyword var to let. You can see it gives us Spain, and if I uncomment this, it will give us a reference error again, and again the same rule will apply with const. So if I go in here and say const and then uncomment this, give us that same error. That's because once a variable is inside a function, it's inside that local scope and can't be accessed anywhere else. Now this is where the similarities of the keywords stop, and the block scope is where you start seeing some of the major differences between var, let and const. So let's talk about block scope now. So let's first take a look at the let keyword. Now the let keyword in many ways is like the cousin of the var keyword. It has a lot of similarities, but one of the major differences is that a let keyword is block scoped. So what I'm going to do is just insert a pre-made if statement underneath this comment. And as you can see, you have an if statement of true, and it's followed by curly braces. Now the curly braces are key because a block scope is a set of opening and closing curly brackets. And as you can see, the console log inside the if statement correctly logs the variable because the message is accessed from inside the scope where it's defined. Now what would you think would happen if I log this variable outside the if statement? So I'm just going to copy this and log it outside. You can see it logs the first one correctly as before, but if we try to log this outside the if statement, you can see it gives us a reference error and it says message is not defined. And the same thing would happen if we try doing it with the const variable. So I'm just going to comment that out and put in here const. So it'll correctly log the hello, but if I comment this out, you can see it gives us that reference error again. Now the var keyword on the other hand is not block scope, so if we tried doing the same thing with var, it would give us a different result. So I'm just going to comment this out and then change this if statement or the variable here to a var keyword. It will give us hello like it would normally with the other two keywords, but if I uncomment this out, it will give us two hellos. And what's essentially happened now is this variable has become part of the global scope and can be accessed from anywhere. And that's one of the key differences between the var keyword and the let and const keyword. Both let and const are block scoped, whereas var isn't. Now you're probably wondering what's the difference between let and const. And the keyword const is just an abbreviation for constant. And like the let keyword, as we just demonstrated, is block scope. Now the major difference between let and const is that you can't reassign a const. So what I'm going to do is just comment this out, and I'm going to create a let variable called my birthday, and this is going to equal to a string, and then I'm just going to log this. If you look in the browser, you can see it's given us that value. Now what we can do with let is that we can reassign. So I'm just going to say my birthday, and I'm going to change this to another string, and if you look in the browser, you can see now this has changed. But as mentioned, const is short for constant, and it's essentially an unchanging variable. So what I'm going to do is just change the variable here to const instead of let, and as you can see, it's giving us an error, and that's because we can't reassign a const variable. And that's essentially the key differences between var, let and const. Now let's take a look at a breakdown slide of what we learned in this lesson. So you can see here in our table we've got the three keywords. You can see that both let and const are block scope, whereas var is only function scoped. And then if we look at reassignment, you can see that you can reassign var, let, but you can't reassign const. Now in summary, it's generally advisable to avoid using var, because as we saw, var is not block scoped, it can be redefined, and this can lead to unpredictable behavior. Furthermore, because var is function scoped, it isn't as obvious as block scope. So generally, if you need to create a variable, use const. However, if you know or think that you need to reassign it later on, use let. But that's it for this video, guys. If you enjoyed the content, please hit the like button and please consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next 5 Minute Fridays.